Dr. IBRAM X. Kendi is a National Book Award-winning author of 16 books for adults and children, including 10 New York Times bestsellers, 5 of which were #1 New York Times bestsellers, including How to Be Anti-Racist, which was described in the New York Times as the most courageous book to date on the problem of race in the Western mind. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a CBS News racial justice contributor, and he is our guest today. I am your host, Ramses Ja.
And I'm your host, Q Ward.
All right, Dr. IBRAM X. Kendi, welcome to the show. It is an honor. We say that from time to time, but whatever is higher than that, that is how today feels. We've been just really excited in the studio, looking forward to this conversation. We couldn't be more pleased that you would take a moment to come and just share your thoughts with us. Now, for our audience that may not be intimately familiar with the work that you do and so forth, and of course, we gave a brief introduction, do us a favor and tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe a little bit about your upbringing, your background, what led you to today's conversation, just to kind of bring folks up to speed so they know who we're talking to today.
Sure. So I'm a professor, an author. I write books on the history of racism and even what it means to be anti-racist, which is to say what it means to challenge racism. And I was born and raised in Queens, New York, went to FAMU. At FAMU, I started thinking about wanting to write as a journalist on racism, went to get my master's in Black Studies because I didn't believe that since I was Black, I was automatically an expert on Black people. Mm-hmm. And then when I was there, I really saw the life of the professor and saw that I felt like I'd have more freedom, so to speak, to really think through and write and research, really for the liberation of Black people. So I decided to become a professor, and here I am.
I love that.
I think it goes without saying that you've been critical of the current administration. In your opinion, I know this will be hard to narrow down, but what are the 3 biggest threats to Black Americans under this Trump administration?
So I think the first, in no order, would be this effort at eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the real sort of desire behind that is to resegregate this country and to eliminate our presence, particularly in places that are coveted and in places of power. I would say, secondly, the efforts at really the mass deportation of immigrants. So African Americans, the overwhelming percentage of African Americans are descendants of enslaved Africans, and were likely here even before most white Americans got here. But they still conceive of us as aliens, as illegal, as not truly Americans. And so I know a lot of Black folks aren't worried about that because they know they're born in this country. Their grandparents were born in this country, but I am, because simultaneously they're trying to do away with even birthright citizenship, right? So to me, there's a connection there. And then the third thing, I would also say is this willingness to weaponize the FBI and policing potentially at levels we haven't seen since the 60s. And as many people know, the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, certainly there were internal strife, but there were so many organizations and leaders who were targeted by the FBI and policing forces, really imploding or exploding, our movements. And I see something similar happening now, in which, over the next few years, we're going to see leaders and organizations being undermined, and really being destroyed, and it's going to be made to seem as if they are the problem, that they did something wrong, and we won't necessarily know the hands of spies and FBI agents behind that.
There's another component here too that I think that a lot of us who were trying to motivate people to vote during the last election, a lot of us that were concerned about Project 2025, there's an additional element with this administration that a lot of us did not even conceive of, and that is Elon Musk. And, for all intents and purposes, Twitter, and by extension, other social media platforms, but Twitter in particular, is sort of a community watering hole. It's almost like something that there's a public discourse element there. It serves the community, and yet it's held by a private citizen, right? And so it's not subjected to FCC laws in the same way that like radio stations were and so forth. And they don't have to give back to the community in the way that television stations, radio stations do per the FCC guidelines. And so it provides a benefit to the community, and the community by and large uses and consumes it, but it's subjected to the whims of a private individual. And with the emergence of Elon Musk sort of functioning almost like an elected representative, though he is not, talk to us a bit about what threat, if any, is associated with Elon Musk in particular, and of course, to a lesser extent or a lesser degree, folks like Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, and other folks like him, and what we can do about that threat.
So, Elon Musk comes from a family of people who not only literally went to South Africa because of apartheid, but then became major defenders and champions of apartheid. That's Elon Musk's family. People who literally, his grandfather was in Canada and was like, yo, look at that white supremacy. They're doing that really well over in South Africa. Moved to South Africa with Elon Musk, his mother, and became a major defender. So that's Elon Musk. So for any Black person to think that Elon Musk or even Twitter is in any way is anything but an engine of white supremacy, you only need to look at Elon Musk's own personal history. And what these leaders are seeking to do today, it just reminds me of, one of the most classic books in African-American history, which was written by Carter G. Woodson, called The Miseducation of the Negro. And that book, and Carter G. talked about the ways in which our schools systematically miseducate us, systematically create our own ignorance so that we can ultimately not confront racism and white supremacy.
Sure.
But what these social media companies are doing, namely Twitter, is they got that down to a science. Like, they're able to micro-target people. So, through their algorithms, they're able to figure out each of our weakest spots or those areas, those groups of people we really don't like, or those reasons why we think there's a problem with Black people, and constantly feed us that information, force feed us that poison, so that we continue to maintain, that the problem is Black people. And we don't even know that it's happening to us, that they're poisoning our minds, that they're force feeding us, that they're micro targeting us where we're weak. but that's precisely what they're doing.
You know, we've noticed a lot of corporations voluntarily rolling back or completely getting rid of DEI initiatives. And historically, one way to fight back was through boycott. I think as of last year, or maybe even as recent as the beginning of this year, the total buying power of the Black consumer is estimated around $2 trillion. That is a more impactful weapon of leverage than I think even Black people realize. Recently, Al Sharpton has called for Black people to boycott, you know, these companies who have made trillions of dollars off of our support. Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think there is something better that we can do? I'd love to hear where you stand there.
So I actually do think it's a good idea, and it's a good idea that's based in history. So of course, two of the most pivotal moments of the civil rights movement were boycotts. Of course, there's the Montgomery bus boycott. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we have fully been taught that the reason why Montgomery, the city, essentially capitulated was because Black people were the primary ones who were taking the buses, right? And so through boycotting those buses, we literally bankrupt the system. The second one, which we don't know as much about, is I'm sure people are familiar with those images from Birmingham, where those young people are being shot with water hoses. And so that was in 1963, where young people were sort of marching in Birmingham. What was also happening is they specifically decided to do that demonstration on Easter weekend. And the reason why they did it on Easter weekend is because Easter weekend was a huge buying day in Birmingham, in downtown Birmingham. So they organically created a boycott of Birmingham's stores, which then compelled the owners of those stores to be like, okay, we can't have too much more of this, right? We need to come and negotiate an end to Jim Crow segregation. And so boycotts historically have been incredibly effective, and I'm just giving those two examples in Alabama, and I think they can be effective now. Now it's going to take time, right? And it's going to take organizing, but I do think it can be effective.
Now, I want to rewind just a bit, because you said something earlier, and I think that we can make that live a little bit more for our audience today. So let's say that we have some listeners who maybe they're not directly connected with immigrants, immigrant communities. It doesn't feel real to them. Let's say that they've listened to the debates during the campaign season, and they've listened to this side say what they're going to say, that side say what they're going to say. You mentioned that immigration is one of the things that people should be concerned about. Let's connect that, if we can, a little bit more to outcomes in this individual who's listening to their lives if they don't themselves know someone who's an immigrant. How does this current, let's call it attack on immigrants, how does this affect those listeners' lives?
So let me just speak first rhetorically.
Okay.
The President of the United States has described Black nations in the same way he's described Black communities. It's the same, he's used the same language. So Black nations and Black communities are incredibly dangerous, to the point in which we're all living in hell. So right. The way he's framed Black people abroad and Black people at home is pretty much the same. Then that same president has not only advocated for border walls so that Black people and brown people won't be able to come in the United States, he's also advocated for border walls around white suburban communities. Like, he has literally argued and eliminated policies that allowed us to gain better access to affordable housing and others, in predominantly white community, So it's interconnected in that sense. But I think in a larger sense, to me, from the standpoint of racist white Americans, they see people of color from the same vantage point, whether we are a citizen or whether we're an immigrant. And their advocacy of policies and programs that refuse to give us as African Americans equal access to opportunities and resources dovetails their refusal to provide immigrants with access to opportunities and resources. It's all connected. But they also recognize that the people who are struggling the most are also going to need more resources. So there's a reason why they pretty adeptly decided that they were going to take immigrants in Texas, in Arizona, in Florida, and send them on planes and buses to Chicago, to Detroit, to New York City. They didn't do that by happenstance. They did that because they wanted us as African Americans to feel as if immigrants were taking resources that were ours, so that we could be just as upset as white Americans. So I'm saying that to say they tricked us. and frankly, there's enough resources for everyone, and opportunities for everyone. But they've led us to believe that there's this sort of zero sum, that we as African Americans, we have to sort of protect ourselves because, if we start advocating for immigrants, then they're going to take our resources. No, what actually happens is we're empowering people who are going to take our resources. That's what actually happens.
I want to stay right there. The forthcoming book, Malcolm Lives. You have a vision with this text. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? Like as a reader, and to our listener, what is it that we should be looking for or looking to gain from Malcolm Lives?
Well, I remember when I was growing up, I didn't particularly when I was in school, I didn't really, history was boring for me. I'm like, why do I have to learn about history? Like that's 50 years ago, 100 years ago. How is it relevant to me in the here and the now? I didn't see it as relevant. So I didn't really, care about history. But what I'm trying to do with Malcolm Lives is show how history lives through the life of Malcolm X. And so many scenes in the book. The book is largely told in scenes, and so many of the scenes in the book are literally not just set in 1961 or 1963, but they're also set in the here and the now, in which Malcolm is both speaking to the moment in 1962 as well as the moment here and now, so that people can see how his message and his legacy lives. And it lives in a moment of spreading anti-Blackness, of Islamophobia, in which Black people are being divided. And this was a man who directly challenged anti-Black racism, who directly challenged Islamophobia, who directly urged Black people to unite. He would oftentimes say to Black people, they don't hang you because you're a Methodist. They don't hang you because you're a Baptist. They hang you because you're Black.
Well, while we're here, one of the things that I've noticed, and this is before we were able to have a conversation, but there's been this kind of new barrier that's come about in, call it the last maybe 8 years. And it has manifested itself in the form of book bannings. And oftentimes, as I mentioned, I've seen books that you've written on these books, certainly more recently. What do you make of the attacks on literature and And ultimately, what do you make of the rebranding of American history as CRT? And what I want from you here is the why in terms of why history is important. I want the why in terms of why are they attacking it, and so forth. Can you give us a little bit more on that?
Sure. I think one of the ways to explain the why is to explain the origins of book banning in this country. The original OG book banners were enslavers. They literally banned abolitionist texts in the South. And at the same time they banned abolitionist texts, they didn't allow Black people to read and write, right? Because they recognized that through reading and writing abolitionist texts, we could realize, if we didn't already, that the problem wasn't us. We could figure out ways to smash and eliminate slavery, which of course was the source, of their riches. And then even the vast majority of white Americans in the South who weren't enslavers could also realize how slavery was harming them too. So they neither wanted Black people nor white people, enslavers did, to recognize that enslavers were the problem, that slavery was the problem, that we collectively were being undermined and to a certain extent oppressed because of those enslavers. And I think it's the same thing now. I think you have so many white Americans who don't know their history, who don't understand the ways in which this current president is literally instituting policies that relative to Black people are going to benefit them, but relative to Black people. But then if you take Black people away, it's ultimately going to harm them.
Exactly.
Right. So for instance, relative to Black people, it's going to benefit white people if they make these tax cuts permanent. But it's actually only going to benefit a small segment of white people. And the vast majority of white people are going to have to essentially pay for those tax cuts for the super rich. And so I think that what education does is it allows people to not be manipulated. And I think that's why I am constantly in the books. I'm like, they're not going to play me. And I know the more I read, the more I understand history, the more I understand the present, the more I'm able to grasp what is being said to me and why. And the more I'm able to prevent people from manipulating me to do things that are against my own interests.
I wish more people would adopt that stance.
Yeah.
We've seen far too many manipulated directly into doing things against their own best interest just because racism.
Yeah.
Flatly. In the wake of the election, and now that the new president has been inaugurated and got right to work on the agenda that we all saw coming, for some people, there's been a sense of hopelessness. Many are looking for some form of decisive, specific, actionable leadership from Democrats to try to regain some of that ground that was lost, over this past election cycle, over this past year. From what we've noticed, the planning or strategy seems fragmented, at best. From your purview, what are some steps that we can take or that our leadership can take that are some viable strategies or viable steps that we can take collectively for liberals and those who believe in who have a more liberal political leaning?
I think it's important just for us to realize that what this current administration is seeking to do is destroy any program or organization that is striving for really equity and justice. And I think the reason why I just wanted to underline that is because if we have a program, or if we're part of an organization, or if we've created a platform, or if there's a platform or program or organization that we like, it's important for us to understand that those organizations, those entities are under attack. And so when something is under attack, what is the solution? To defend it, to protect it, to fund it, to support it, to ensure that it's going to survive this attack. And if anything, to grow it, right, in the midst, of the storm, to create new entities and organizations, and platforms that are anti-racist. And I just want to sort of emphasize that, because there's a number of entities that we already are in our backyards that we could be supporting. And those are the entities that we need to ensure that survive. And those are the entities that are going to power the movement that can ultimately create a new world.
So I want to ask something here that has come up quite a bit. So, Q and myself, we spend a lot of time in the deep end of, the right wing, media circles and chat rooms and so forth, just to keep an eye on what they are talking about, what it is that they think is accurate and so forth, so that we know how to have conversations that we believe our listeners can use to make the changes in their individual communities. And there's this persistent narrative, which I suspect that, I haven't been alive forever, but I suspect this has been a narrative that has existed for some time. But certainly in recent years, and certainly in recent months, there's this narrative that exists that suggests that white men are under attack, and that everything that benefits someone who is not a white man indeed comes at their expense. And so if a white man is not thriving or prospering or whatever, this narrative fits nicely into their worldview, because they can easily point to Black people, immigrants, etc. What would you say to people that kind of harbor this sentiment that white men or white people are under attack? And how would our listeners challenge that narrative in their day-to-day lives as they attempt to go out and, perhaps they're at the beginning stages, but they're trying to be anti-racist themselves?
Sure. I think first, white men, like Black men, are not a monolith. There are many different groups of white men. Mm-hmm. There's only a very small number of white men who are super wealthy, who are heterosexual, who are Protestant, and so if you actually break down white men, working class white men and impoverished white men are actually under attack, but not by the forces that they think. Mm-hmm. It's actually the forces that they're voting for that are making it harder for them to organize and unionize, that's cutting sort of government resources and benefits that help them, that is stripping away funding for things like cancer research that can actually benefit them, that is costing them more money out of their pocket because of the cost of food and eggs, which continues to sort of go up. And so for a working class white male, and the vast majority of white men, again, are not rich. When you have a government that is controlled by billionaires, like that, those certainly billionaires are not acting in the best interest of working class white men. They're acting in the best interest of billionaire white men. And then you've had a number of white men who are gay, who've had books that have been banned. They can't teach their children, about homophobia, just as Black parents can't teach their children, about Black history because of book bans. You've had white Jewish men who faced all sorts of anti-Semitism from white supremacists. You've had white men who are Democrats who live in states whereby this government is like, I'm not sending any funding to California. Like, that's a blue state. I don't care about y'all. You've had, and so I think you can go down the list of different groups of white men to really talk to them about how this administration's policies are actually not benefiting them and actually are hurting them. And I think when we speak about white men in a monolith, as a monolith, I think it actually helps those forces that are seeking to harm white men, because then you have white men who are making $30,000 a year who are somehow identifying with billionaires when there's no relationship between them. And the reason why they're only making $30,000 is because of the policies those billionaire politicians are supporting.
Yeah, I think white supremacy has as its superpower that white men do have a monolithic view of themselves. So they are united in those that they choose to oppress. Black people are not a monolith, and we wear that and we say that proudly, but the lack of solidarity in that way has proven to be a weakness, because, you know, we tend to find the one thing that we disagree on and make that the champion divider of everything that we're trying to do, while those who oppress us and oppose us can disagree on everything except for the fact that white people are superior. And their monolithic view in that regard has been their superpower in organizing and strategizing, and showing up when it's time to vote against their own best interests, because as long as it's against black people, then it must be the right thing to do. Your insight, your writing, your mind, your point of view are things that, you know, these two gentlemen over here consider national treasures, man. For our listeners who are being introduced to you today, when is Malcolm Lives going to be released? Where can they find you? How can they support you? Social media, websites. We do not want this to be the last time that people who are hearing your voice for the first time hear it. And we want to make sure that we are as engaged as we can be, because we benefit greatly from just being in your company, sir.
And I just want to thank each of you for having these thoughtful and really critical conversations. You know, I can only imagine the number of listeners who've been able to go on their own transformative intellectual journey because of the conversations that, and even the insight you provided them. And so I'm just excited to be able to be in conversation with you. Malcolm Lives is dropping May 13th, which is about a week before Malcolm turns 100 years old, 6 days before he turns 100 years old on May 19th of this year. And Malcolm Lives is pretty much available wherever books, you know, are sold. And my handle on social is my first name, IBRAM XK. And then, you know, of course, I'm here on my website's IBRAMXKendi.com. So I'm around, follow me, engage, but I'm really excited about Malcolm Lives. I feel like I've been working on this book my whole life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're excited to check it out ourselves. And once again, it's important for people who are just coming to the table in terms of, you know, their activism, just coming to the table in terms of how they choose to resist tyranny and whatever, for folks that are just coming to the table, to plug into some good resources. And indeed, for folks that listen to me and Q, either on the Black Information Network, on Civic, Cipher, on any of the shows that we do, just know that Dr. IBRAM XK is one such North Star that we look to quote a term that Q uses quite frequently. You know, people have told us in recent, you know, weeks and months that now our voice is more important than ever, which feels kind of crazy because, you know, of course, we, like many folks, thought the world was going to go in a kinder, more intellectually superior direction. But we understand the spirit in which that compliment is paid to us, that what we do now means more than it ever has. And that's a compliment that we'd like to pay forward to you, sir, because your voice now is more important. It's very easy for us to wonder if we're going crazy. Did we miss something? Why is this happening? What is this normal? And for a person such as yourself, who's so connected to history, a person who is such an introspective and insightful orator and author, a person who just kind of has some insight and kind of lives in a space where a lot of people don't, because they have to go to work and then they have to take care of these kids, and they can only tap in from time to time. That's all the bandwidth they have. It's important for us to make sure that we tell you, of course, but we also tell our listeners that there are some folks that really do have the game, so to speak, in our estimation, and you're one such individual. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank you again very much for your time and your insight, of course, coming onto the show to share some of your thoughts, and of course your upcoming book. It means the world to us. Once again, today's guest is Dr. IBRAM X. Kendi, a National Book Award-winning author of the forthcoming book, Malcolm Lives.